Hi, I'm Theodore Morrowind. At my grandfather's burial, my brother Darian stood at the podium and called me a vulture circling for scraps in front of 200 mourners. The entire Morrowind family nodded in agreement as he painted me as the opportunistic grandson who only showed up when money was involved. They whispered gold digger and shame as I walked past the casket. But I wasn't upset, I was actually smiling. Because hidden in my coat pocket was a sealed envelope that would make Darian's confident smirk disappear forever. They thought they knew grandfather's final wishes. Turns out the old man had been playing chess while they were playing checkers. And when that lawyer read the will 3 days later, well, let's just say $35 million has a way of silencing the loudest voices. But what hurt more than their accusations? It was discovering who had been poisoning grandfather against me for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I arrived at Willowbrook Cemetery 15 minutes before the service was scheduled to begin. The morning air in Thornfield carried the scent of freshly turned earth, and the kind of autumn chill that made your breath visible. Grandfather's burial plot sat on a gentle hill overlooking the valley where he'd built his empire from nothing more than a single hardware store and an unshakable work ethic. Cars lined the narrow cemetery road, black sedans and luxury SUVs stretching back toward the main gate. The Morrowind family had turned out in force, along with business associates, longtime employees, and half the town council. My grandfather, Lucian Morrowind, had been the kind of man who commanded respect through action rather than words, and his passing had shaken the entire community of Thornfield. I parked my modest sedan behind a row of Mercedes and BMWs, straightening my black tie as I walked toward the gathering crowd. The funeral home had set up white folding chairs in neat rows facing the mahogany casket, which was suspended over the open grave by a mechanical lowering device. Floral arrangements formed a colorful wall behind the seating area, their sweet fragrance mixing with the earthier scents of the cemetery. As I approached, conversations quieted. Heads turned, I caught fragments of whispered comments. There he is. Showing up now, of course. Probably hoping for something in the will. I kept my expression neutral, nodding politely to faces I recognized from family gatherings I had attended sporadically over the years. My relationship with the extended Morrowind clan had always been complicated. While my brother Darian had embraced the family business and social expectations, I'd chosen a different path, working as a freelance architectural consultant and maintaining my independence. Grandfather had always supported my decision, even when it disappointed other family members. A man has to find his own way, he'd told me once. Following someone else's blueprint never built anything worthwhile. I took a seat in the third row, behind the immediate family section where Darian sat with his wife Corinna and their 2 teenagers. My Aunt Delia occupied the front row with her husband, while my cousins Valentino and Kaylin flanked them with their respective families. The hierarchy was clear, established, and I was definitely on the periphery. The service began with words from Pastor Hendricks, who'd known grandfather for over 30 years. He spoke about Lucian's integrity, his generosity to local charities, and his dedication to family. Standard eulogy material, but genuine in its delivery. Several employees from Morrowind Enterprises shared brief memories, describing a boss who remembered birthdays, helped with medical bills, and created opportunities for advancement. Then came the family tributes. Darian rose first, adjusting his expensive suit jacket as he approached the small podium the funeral director had positioned near the casket. At 42, my older brother had inherited grandfather's imposing height and silver-streaked hair, but his demeanor carried a polish that our grandfather had never bothered with. Where Lucian had been direct and unpretentious, Darian was calculated and image-conscious. My grandfather was the foundation of our family, Darian began, his voice carrying easily across the gathering. He taught us the value of hard work, the importance of loyalty, and the responsibility that comes with success. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Darian had always been the better public speaker, the natural politician in the family. Lucian Morrowind built something lasting, he continued. Not just a business, but a legacy. He understood that true wealth isn't measured only in dollars, but in the relationships we nurture and the values we pass down to future generations. I shifted in my seat, sensing the direction this was heading. Unfortunately, Darian's tone grew more somber. Not everyone in a family shares those values. Some people view relationships as transactions. Some people only appear when there's something to be gained. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. I felt eyes turning toward me, curious and judgmental glances from relatives and family friends who were beginning to understand that this wasn't just a tribute to grandfather's memory. My grandfather was generous to a fault, Darian continued, his gaze finding mine across the rows of chairs. He always believed the best in people, even when their actions suggested otherwise. He kept hoping that blood would prove thicker than selfishness. My Aunt Dahlia nodded vigorously, shooting me a pointed look. My cousin Valentino crossed his arms, his expression one of barely concealed disgust. But real family shows up. Darian's voice grew stronger, more accusatory. Real family doesn't disappear for months at a time, only to surface when someone's health is failing. Real family doesn't treat a dying man like a business opportunity. The words hit like physical blows. Around me, the gathering grew uncomfortably quiet. A few people shifted in their seats, embarrassed by the public family drama but unable to look away. Theodore, Darian said my name like it tasted bitter. My brother couldn't be bothered to visit grandfather during his final illness. Too busy with his projects, his clients, his own concerns. But he made time for the hospital visits once the diagnosis became terminal. Funny how priorities can change when inheritance becomes a possibility. I wanted to stand up, to defend myself, to tell everyone about the private conversations grandfather and I had shared during those hospital visits. How he'd held my hand and told me he was proud of the man I'd become. How he'd worried about the family dynamics after his death and made me promise to stay strong. How he'd given me specific instructions about certain documents and told me to trust his lawyer above all others. But I didn't speak. Something deep in my gut told me to wait, to let Darian expose himself fully before I revealed what I knew. Vultures circle overhead before they descend to feed, Darian concluded, his eyes locked on mine. Some of them even wear family names. The gathering erupted in subtle but unmistakable reactions. Whispered conversations, exchanged glances, and more than a few nods of agreement with Darian's assessment. I felt the weight of collective judgment settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat. As Darian returned to his seat, my Aunt Dahlia reached over to squeeze his hand in a gesture of support. My cousin Kalen shook his head sadly, as if mourning not just grandfather's death but my moral failure. Pastor Hendricks attempted to restore some dignity to the proceedings with a final prayer and blessing, but the damage was done. As the casket was lowered into the ground and family members took turns throwing handfuls of earth into the grave, I felt like I was being buried alongside my grandfather. The reception at Darian's house afterward was even worse. I almost didn't attend, but something compelled me to endure the social torture. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or maybe I needed to hear exactly what the family really thought of me. The conversations I overheard were brutal in their casual cruelty. Always was the odd one out. Never understood family responsibility. Lucian spoiled him, and this is the result. Probably thinks he's entitled to something. I stood alone in Darian's backyard, holding a plate of food I had no appetite for, watching my relatives cluster together in tight groups that didn't include me. The message was clear. I was no longer truly part of this family. But in my coat pocket, pressed against my chest like a talisman, was the envelope grandfather had given me 3 weeks before his death. His handwriting on the outside was shaky but legible. For Theodore. Open only after the funeral. Trust no one else. I hadn't opened it yet, respecting his wishes, but I could feel its weight and importance. Whatever was inside had been significant enough for grandfather to insist on secrecy, significant enough for him to make me promise never to mention it to anyone. As the afternoon wore on and the accusations continued to swirl around me like poison in the air, I found myself actually looking forward to discovering what grandfather had left me. Not because I was the opportunist they claimed, but because I suspected the old man had seen this day coming and prepared accordingly. Theodore Morrowind had always been 3 steps ahead of everyone else. I was beginning to suspect his final move would be his most decisive. The week following the funeral passed in a haze of silence and isolation. I returned to my apartment in Millbrook, 30 miles from Thornfield, and tried to resume my normal routine. But the weight of what had happened at the cemetery followed me everywhere. I found myself replaying Darian's public humiliation speech, examining each word for the venom it contained. 3 days after the burial, I finally opened grandfather's envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with instructions written in his careful handwriting. Theodore, go to my safe deposit box at First National Bank of Thornfield. Box 347. The key is taped under the bottom drawer of my desk at home. Trust only Margaret Fenwick at Fenwick & Associates Law Firm. Tell no one else about this, until she says it's time. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The instructions were followed by the bank's address and Margaret Fenwick's contact information. At the bottom, in heavier ink as if he'd pressed down harder with the pen, grandfather had written, "They think they know everything. They know nothing." I stared at those final words for a long time, wondering what secrets grandfather had been keeping and why he'd chosen me as his confidant. The old man had always been strategic, methodical in his thinking. Nothing he did was random or emotional. Getting access to his house proved more complicated than expected. When I arrived at the Morrowind family estate on Thursday morning, I found the locks had been changed. A security company placard by the front door listed a number I didn't recognize. I called Darian from the driveway. "Theodore." His voice carried the same dismissive tone he'd used at the funeral. "What do you want?" "I need to get something from grandfather's study. Just a few personal items he promised me." A long pause. "The house is being prepared for estate inventory. Nothing can be removed until the legal process is complete. It's just some books and a photo. Sentimental stuff. Like I said, nothing leaves the house until probate is finished. Sorry." He wasn't sorry at all. I could hear the satisfaction in his voice, the pleasure he took in denying me access. "When will that be?" "Could take months. Depends on how complicated things get." The threat was implicit but clear. Darian controlled the timeline, and he intended to make things as difficult as possible for me. After ending the call, I sat in my car staring at the house where I'd spent countless childhood weekends. The two-story colonial, with its wraparound porch and mature oak trees, had always represented stability and family connection. Now it felt like a fortress designed to keep me out. I drove around to the back of the property, parking near the old carriage house that grandfather had converted into his private workshop. To my surprise, the building wasn't secured with the same electronic locks as the main house. The traditional deadbolt still operated with the key grandfather had given me years earlier. Inside, everything remained exactly as he'd left it. Hand tools hung in precise arrangements on pegboard walls. His workbench held a half-finished birdhouse, sawdust still scattered around the base. The familiar smell of wood stain and mineral spirits brought back memories of Saturday mornings spent learning carpentry basics under his patient guidance. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I needed to get into the main house, and I remembered that grandfather had installed a connecting door between the workshop and the kitchen during renovations 5 years earlier. He'd wanted easy access to tools without having to walk around the building in bad weather. The connecting door was locked from the inside, but the lock was a simple interior knob that I could manipulate with a butter knife from the workshop's small kitchenette. Within minutes I was standing in grandfather's kitchen, heart pounding with the awareness that I was technically breaking and entering. The house felt different now, empty in a way that went beyond grandfather's absence. Someone had been through his belongings systematically. Books were stacked in boxes marked for donation. Personal photographs had been sorted into piles. Furniture wore tags indicating which family member had claimed each piece. In his study, I found the desk that had been his command center for decades. The bottom drawer was locked, but grandfather had taught me years ago that most desk locks could be bypassed with a paperclip and patience. The key was exactly where he'd said it would be, taped to the drawer's underside with electrical tape. But that wasn't the only thing I found. Hidden behind the key, also secured with tape, was a small digital recording device. My hands shook as I peeled it free and pressed the play button. Grandfather's voice filled the quiet study, weak but determined. "Theodore, if you're hearing this, then they've already started. I know what Darian and Dahlia are planning. I've known for months." I sank into his leather chair, gripping the device with both hands. "They think I'm a foolish old man who doesn't understand family politics. They think I don't know about the meetings at Dahlia's house, the conversations about my mental competence, the suggestions that I should be evaluated for dementia." My stomach dropped. The family had been plotting against grandfather while he was alive, questioning his mental state to undermine his decision-making authority. Darian has been positioning himself as my heir apparent for years, grandfather continued. He's convinced the rest of the family that he's the responsible choice, the stable one who understands business and family obligation. He's painted you as irresponsible and opportunistic because you chose independence over conformity. The recording continued for another 10 minutes, detailing conversations grandfather had overheard, plans he'd discovered, and manipulation he'd witnessed. The family I'd grown up with, the relatives who'd just spent a week treating me like a pariah, had been systematically working to isolate me and position Darian as the rightful successor to grandfather's legacy. They expect me to leave everything to Darian, grandfather concluded. They've been operating under that assumption for so long, they've stopped being careful about hiding their true feelings. Your brother has already picked out new furniture for this study. Delia has been touring retirement homes for me, telling friends that my judgment isn't what it used to be. The final revelation was the most painful. They don't think I know, but I heard Darian tell Corinna that you only started visiting me in the hospital because you knew I was dying. He said you were, circling like a vulture, planning to contest whatever will I left. The same words he'd used at the funeral. This wasn't spontaneous grief-fueled anger. This was a calculated character assassination that had been planned weeks in advance. I turned off the recording and sat in the silence of grandfather's study, surrounded by the belongings that Darian had already begun claiming. The betrayal went deeper than public humiliation. They'd been working to undermine my relationship with grandfather while he was alive, spreading poison about my motives and integrity. But grandfather had seen through their manipulation. He'd known exactly what was happening and had planned accordingly. I pocketed the recording device and the bank key, then left the house the way I'd entered. As I drove toward First National Bank, I found myself thinking about all the family gatherings where I'd felt subtly excluded, all the conversations that had stopped when I entered a room, all the times Darian had made decisions about grandfather's care without consulting me. It hadn't been paranoia or oversensitivity. There really had been a conspiracy, and I'd been too trusting to recognize it. The safe deposit box contained documents that made everything clear. A will dated 6 months before grandfather's death, naming me as primary beneficiary. Financial records showing the true scope of his wealth, far beyond what the family suspected, and a detailed letter explaining his reasoning for every decision. Theodore, the letter began, you are the only family member who never asked me for anything, never tried to influence my decisions, never treated me like a resource to be managed or an obstacle to be overcome. In a family full of people positioning themselves for inheritance, you were the only one who seemed to care about me as a person rather than a bank account. By the time I finished reading, my hands were shaking again. Not from fear this time, but from the magnitude of what grandfather had entrusted to me. $35 million in various assets, including the family home, the business properties, and investment portfolios that Darian didn't even know existed. The family that had just spent a week calling me an opportunist was about to discover that the real opportunist had been far more successful than they'd imagined. Margaret Fenwick's law office occupied the top floor of a converted Victorian mansion in downtown Thornfield, the kind of building that whispered old money and established tradition. Her receptionist, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, led me through a maze of hallways lined with oil paintings and legal texts that looked like they'd been collecting dust since the Civil War. Margaret herself was nothing like I'd expected. Instead of the elderly conservative attorney I'd imagined, she was perhaps 45, with silver-streaked auburn hair and the kind of intense green eyes that missed nothing. She wore a tailored navy suit that managed to look both professional and slightly rebellious, and her handshake was firm enough to crack knuckles. Theodore Morrowind, she said, studying my face as if comparing it to a mental photograph. Your grandfather spoke about you often, always with pride, I should mention. Her office was warm and inviting, with Persian rugs over hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that held an eclectic mix of legal volumes and what appeared to be mystery novels. 2 wingback chairs faced her antique mahogany desk, and she gestured for me to take one while she settled into the other. I assume you found what he left for you, she continued, or you wouldn't be here. I nodded, pulling the documents from my briefcase. The will, the financial statements, and his letter, plus this recording device. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly when she saw the recorder. He didn't mention that to me, may I? I handed it over and watched her face as she listened to grandfather's voice detailing the family's betrayal. Her expression grew darker with each revelation, and by the time the recording ended, her jaw was set in a hard line. "Bastards," she said quietly, then looked up at me with something approaching sympathy. "I'm sorry, Theodore. I know this can't be easy to hear." "I suspected some of it," I admitted, "but not the full scope. How long have you known about his plans?" "Your grandfather approached me 8 months ago," Margaret explained, returning to her chair. "He'd become concerned about family dynamics and wanted to ensure his final wishes would be respected. We spent considerable time structuring everything to minimize potential challenges." She pulled a thick folder from her desk drawer and opened it to reveal legal documents I couldn't identify from across the room. "The will you found is legitimate and properly executed. However, your grandfather was also a practical man who understood family politics. He anticipated that your brother and other relatives would not accept his decisions gracefully." Margaret's tone grew more serious as she continued. "There will be attempts to contest the will, claims of undue influence, mental incompetence, fraud, any legal avenue they can pursue. Your grandfather prepared for that as well." She handed me a document titled Lucian Morrowind Mental Competency Evaluation, dated just 3 months before his death. The letterhead belonged to a respected psychiatric practice in the state capital. "He arranged for a comprehensive mental health assessment when he learned about their whispered concerns," Margaret explained. "Dr. Harrison's evaluation confirms full mental competency, excellent cognitive function, and clear decision-making ability. Any claims of dementia or diminished capacity will be easily refuted." I scanned the evaluation, noting the detailed testing results and the doctor's unequivocal conclusion that grandfather was of sound mind when he'd revised his will. "There's more," Margaret continued. "Your grandfather also documented their behavior extensively. He kept copies of emails, recorded phone conversations, and maintained detailed notes about family meetings and discussions. He built a comprehensive case file proving their attempts to manipulate him and undermine your relationship with him." The folder seemed to grow heavier in my hands as I realized the depth of grandfather's preparation. He hadn't just made arrangements for his death, he'd prepared for war. However, Margaret's tone shifted, becoming more cautious. "We need to be strategic about how we proceed. The family is expecting a traditional will reading, where your brother inherits the majority of assets. They've been operating under that assumption for months." She stood and walked to the window overlooking Thornfield's main street, where afternoon shoppers moved between boutiques and cafes that had anchored the town's economy for generations. "I received a call from Darian yesterday," she continued without turning around. "He's demanding an immediate will reading, claiming the family needs closure and certainty about estate matters. He's also retained his own attorney, which suggests he's preparing for legal challenges." "What kind of challenges?" Margaret returned to her seat, her expression grim. "If we reveal the true contents of the will immediately, they'll have time to mount a coordinated attack. Claims that you manipulated a sick old man, that the will was forged or signed under duress, that your grandfather wasn't competent, despite medical evidence to the contrary." She leaned forward, studying my face intently. "Your grandfather anticipated this scenario. He wanted me to give them enough rope to hang themselves with." "What do you mean?" "He prepared a second will," Margaret explained, pulling another document from the folder, "a decoy that gives them exactly what they expect. Darian receives the business and primary assets, you get a modest inheritance, and everyone else gets token amounts. It's convincing enough to satisfy their assumptions." I stared at the fake will, noting grandfather's signature and the official notarization. "But why?" "Because people reveal their true nature when they think they've won," Margaret said with a slight smile. "Your grandfather wanted them to show their colors completely before the truth emerged. He wanted them to make mistakes, to gloat, to confirm everything he suspected about their motivations." The strategy was brilliant and slightly cruel, which sounded exactly like something grandfather would devise. He'd always believed that patience and preparation defeated impulsiveness and greed. So what happens now? Margaret consulted her calendar, flipping through pages marked with appointments and court dates. "I've scheduled the will reading for Monday morning at 10 o'clock. The entire family will be present, along with their attorneys. I'll present the decoy will first and observe their reactions." "And then?" "Then we wait," she said simply. "We let them celebrate, let them make plans, let them show us exactly who they really are." Your grandfather was very specific about this part. He wanted them to have time to reveal their true feelings about you and about him. I felt a chill of anticipation mixed with dread. "How long do we wait?" "2 weeks," Margaret replied. "Long enough for them to make serious mistakes, but not so long that they can cause irreversible damage to estate assets. Your grandfather was very precise about the timeline." She handed me a business card with her direct phone number written on the back. "During those 2 weeks, I need you to be patient. Don't react to their gloating. Don't defend yourself against their accusations. And absolutely don't reveal what you know. Let them think they've won completely." "That's going to be difficult." "I imagine it will be," Margaret agreed. "But your grandfather endured months of their manipulation and betrayal while planning his response. 2 weeks of patience will seem insignificant compared to the satisfaction of watching them realize how thoroughly they underestimated him." As I prepared to leave, Margaret touched my arm gently. "Theodore, I want you to understand something. Your grandfather didn't choose you as his heir out of spite or revenge against the others. He chose you because he genuinely believed you were the only family member who loved him for himself rather than his money. How can you be sure?" "Because he told me," she said simply. "Every conversation we had about estate planning, he talked about your character, your integrity, your independence. He was proud of the man you'd become, and he wanted to ensure that his legacy went to someone who would honor it, rather than simply spend it." Walking back to my car, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders alongside the anticipation of vindication. Grandfather had trusted me with more than money. He'd trusted me with justice. The next 4 days until the will reading passed slowly. I maintained my normal routine, working on architectural projects and avoiding contact with family members. But I found myself constantly checking my phone, half expecting calls or messages that never came. On Sunday evening, I drove past Darian's house and saw cars filling the driveway and street. A family gathering, probably a celebration dinner before the will reading. Through the living room windows, I could see relatives clustered around the dining table, wine glasses raised in toasts. They were celebrating grandfather's death and their anticipated inheritance while I sat alone in my car holding secrets that would change everything. 24 hours from now, their confident smiles would disappear forever. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that made Thornfield's autumn colors look muted and sad. I dressed carefully in my best charcoal suit, the same one I'd worn to grandfather's funeral, and drove to Margaret Fenwick's office with my stomach churning like a washing machine. The parking lot was full of expensive cars. Mercedes sedans, BMW SUVs, and Darian's pristine Tesla Model S lined the spaces like a luxury automobile showroom. I parked my modest Honda between 2 vehicles that cost more than I made in a year and took a deep breath before walking inside. The receptionist led me to a conference room I hadn't seen during my previous visit. It was larger than Margaret's office, with an oval mahogany table that could seat 16 people and oil paintings of stern-faced judges watching from the walls. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting shadows across the polished wood surface. The family was already assembled, and the seating arrangement told its own story. Darian sat at the head of the table opposite Margaret's chair, with his wife Corinna to his right and my Aunt Dahlia to his left. Valentino and Kaylin occupied chairs along one side with their spouses, while various cousins and their families filled the remaining seats. A single empty chair sat at the foot of the table, clearly designated for me, the family equivalent of the defendant's chair. Conversation stopped as I entered. 20 pairs of eyes tracked my movement across the room, and the silence felt heavy enough to crush bones. I nodded politely to faces that didn't nod back, and took my assigned seat without comment. Darian wore a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and his smile carried the satisfaction of a man whose victory was already assured. He brought an attorney, a sharp-faced woman in her 30s, who sat beside him with a legal pad and predatory alertness. "Good morning, everyone," Margaret began once she'd taken her place at the head of the table. Her voice was professionally neutral, giving no hint of the bombshell she was prepared to deliver. "Thank you all for being here during what I know is a difficult time." She opened a leather portfolio and withdrew several documents, arranging them carefully on the table surface. "We're here for the reading of Lucian Morrowind's last will and testament, dated September 15th of this year." That date sent murmurs around the table. September 15th was only 6 weeks before grandfather's death, more recent than anyone had expected. Before we begin, Margaret continued, I want to remind everyone that this is a legal proceeding. The will I'm about to read has been properly executed, witnessed, and notarized according to state law. Any questions about specific provisions should be directed to me after the reading is complete. Darian leaned forward slightly, his confidence radiating across the table like heat from a furnace. Dahlia clasped her hands together as if preparing to receive communion. Even the younger family members looked eager rather than sorrowful, their grief apparently overcome by anticipation of inheritance. I, Lucian Morrowind, being of sound mind and body, Margaret began reading, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils, and declare this to be my final will and testament. Standard language, but the formal tone made everything feel more real. This was really happening. Grandfather's voice was speaking through legal documents, making his final wishes known to the family that had spent months plotting against him. To my beloved grandson Darian Morrowind, who has shown dedication to the family business and understanding of financial responsibility, I leave the controlling interest in Morrowind Enterprises, including all subsidiary companies, properties, and business assets valued at approximately $18 million. Darian's smile widened, though he tried to maintain appropriate solemnity. Corinna squeezed his hand under the table. Dahlia actually sighed with relief. Margaret continued reading through a list of bequests. Dahlia received the vacation property in the mountains plus $2 million. Valentino got $1 million and grandfather's collection of antique firearms. Kaylin inherited the vintage car collection and enough money to maintain it properly. Each announcement brought satisfied nods and barely suppressed excitement. The family was getting exactly what they'd expected, confirmation that their campaign to isolate me had succeeded completely. To my grandson Theodore Morrowind, Margaret read, and the room fell silent with anticipation of my humiliation. I leave the sum of $50,000 and my personal library with hopes that he will find wisdom in the books that guided my life. The amount was insulting. $50,000 was pocket change compared to what everyone else was receiving, barely enough to buy a decent car. The library was a nice gesture, but essentially worthless from a financial perspective. I felt every eye in the room watching for my reaction. Would I explode in anger? Beg for reconsideration? Demand an explanation? Instead, I did what grandfather had taught me. I waited. Are there any immediate questions about these provisions? Margaret asked, looking around the table. Darian cleared his throat. I think I speak for the family when I say that grandfather was generous and fair in his distributions. Everyone received inheritances that reflect their relationships with him and their contributions to family welfare. Several relatives murmured agreement. The message was clear. I'd gotten exactly what I deserved for being an opportunistic outsider. Actually, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since arriving, I do have a question. The room tensed. Margaret raised an eyebrow, playing her part perfectly. Yes, Theodore? Is that the only will grandfather executed this year? The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Darian's confident expression flickered briefly before returning to full strength. What do you mean? He asked. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew the documents I'd taken from grandfather's safe deposit box. Because I have a will dated October 20th, 3 weeks after the one you just read. Margaret's eyes widened in apparent surprise. May I see that, please? The family erupted in whispered conversations as I handed over the documents. Darian's attorney leaned over to examine them, her expression growing more concerned with each page. This appears to be authentic, Margaret announced after several minutes of examination, properly signed, witnessed, and notarized. And it explicitly revokes all previous wills. That's impossible, Darian said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. Grandfather would have told someone. He wouldn't have made major changes without discussing them with family. Perhaps he did discuss them, I said calmly, just not with the family members he should have trusted. Margaret began reading from the new will, and with each word, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. I, Lucian Morrowind, being of sound mind and having become aware of attempts by certain family members to manipulate my decisions and undermine my relationships with others, do hereby revoke all previous wills. Dahlia's face had gone pale. Valentino shifted uncomfortably in his chair. To my grandson Theodore Morrowind, who has shown integrity, independence, and genuine affection unmarred by financial motivation, I leave the entirety of my estate, including all business interests, properties, investments, and personal assets, valued at approximately $35 million. The silence that followed was absolute. No one breathed, moved, or spoke. 20 family members sat frozen like statues while the magnitude of grandfather's decisions sank in. I had inherited everything. Every business, every property, every investment account. The family that had spent months positioning themselves for inheritance had been completely cut out, except for small token amounts to cover legal challenges. Darian was the first to break the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not possible." "It's not only possible," I replied, reaching back into my briefcase, "it's documented." I placed the recording device on the table and pressed play. Grandfather's voice filled the conference room, detailing every conversation he'd overheard, every manipulation he'd discovered, every betrayal that had driven his final decision. "They think I'm a foolish old man who doesn't understand family politics. They think I don't know about the meetings at Dahlia's house, the conversations about my mental competence, the suggestions that I should be evaluated for dementia." Dahlia's hand flew to her throat, as if she couldn't breathe. Valentino stared at the device like it was a venomous snake. "Darian has been positioning himself as my heir apparent for years. He's convinced the rest of the family that he's the responsible choice, the stable one who understands business and family obligation. He's painted Theodore as irresponsible and opportunistic because Theodore chose independence over conformity." As grandfather's voice continued revealing their secrets, family members began looking at each other with panic and accusation. The unified front they'd presented moments earlier was cracking apart like ice in spring. "Your brother has already picked out new furniture for this study," the recording continued. "Dahlia has been touring retirement homes for me, telling friends that my judgment isn't what it used to be." "Turn it off," Darian said hoarsely. "I heard Darian tell Corinna that Theodore only started visiting me in the hospital because he knew I was dying. He said Theodore was, circling like a vulture, planning to contest whatever will I left." The exact words from the funeral speech. The entire room now understood that Darian's emotional tribute had been a calculated performance based on lies he'd been spreading for months. "Theodore," grandfather's voice concluded, "you are the only family member who never asked me for anything, never tried to influence my decisions, never treated me like a resource to be managed or an obstacle to be overcome. In a family full of people positioning themselves for inheritance, you were the only one who seemed to care about me as a person rather than a bank account." I turned off the recording and looked around the table at faces that had transformed from confident satisfaction to shock, fear, and desperate calculation. "Any questions about this will?" I asked quietly. The opportunist had just inherited $35 million, and the vultures were about to learn what it felt like to be prey. The conference room erupted like a dam bursting. 20 voices competed for dominance as the reality of grandfather's final betrayal sank in. Darian shot to his feet so violently that his chair toppled backward, while Dahlia pressed both hands to her chest as if having a heart attack. "This is fraud," Darian shouted, pointing at me like I was a war criminal. "You manipulated a sick old man. You probably forged that will yourself." His attorney was frantically scribbling notes while trying to examine the documents Margaret had placed on the table. "We'll need forensic analysis of the signatures," she announced. "Handwriting experts, psychiatric evaluations of the deceased's mental state, investigation of potential coercion." $35 million. Valentino kept repeating, staring at the wall as if the numbers were written there in fire. $35 million. Corinna had buried her face in her hands and was making soft, sobbing sounds that might have been grief or rage. Kalen sat frozen in his chair like a statue, apparently unable to process what had just happened. "He was senile," Dahlia declared, her voice shrill with desperation. Anyone could see it. Forgetting names, repeating stories, getting confused about dates. Theodore took advantage of a man with dementia. "Actually," Margaret interjected calmly, sliding a document across the table, "Dr. Harrison's psychiatric evaluation from 3 months ago confirms that your father was mentally competent and showed no signs of cognitive decline." The medical report landed in front of Dahlia like a death sentence. She picked it up with trembling hands, her face growing paler as she read the doctor's unequivocal conclusions about grandfather's mental acuity. "This is all planned," Darian said, beginning to pace behind his overturned chair. "You've been working on this for months, haven't you? Visiting him in the hospital, pretending to care while you poisoned his mind against his real family." "The recording suggests otherwise," I replied evenly. "Grandfather discovered your plans on his own. I had no idea about any of this until after the funeral." "Liar." The word came out like a hiss. "You've always been jealous of what I built with the family business. This is your revenge for being the outsider, the failure who couldn't commit to anything meaningful." His voice was rising with each accusation, the polished veneer he'd maintained at the funeral completely stripped away. This was the real Darian, the one grandfather had seen through so clearly. "I'm calling our attorney," Corinna announced, pulling out her phone. "We're contesting this immediately. Undue influence, mental incompetence, fraud, whatever it takes." "You're welcome to try," Margaret said with professional courtesy that didn't quite hide her satisfaction. "However, you should know that your father anticipated legal challenges. He prepared extensively to defend his decisions." She opened another folder and began distributing photocopied documents around the table. "These are transcripts of recorded conversations, email printouts, and handwritten notes documenting various family members' attempts to manipulate his decisions. He was quite thorough in his documentation." I watched my relatives' faces as they recognized their own words reflecting back at them. Conversations they'd thought were private, schemes they believed were secret, manipulations they'd assumed went unnoticed. "He was recording us," Kalen said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "His own family. He was protecting himself," I corrected. "And protecting me from exactly what's happening right now." Darian stopped pacing and fixed me with a stare that could have melted steel. "You think you've won? You think this is over? I built that business from nothing while you were playing with blueprints. I know every client, every employee, every supplier. Without me, Morrowind Enterprises will collapse within 6 months." "Then I guess we'll find out how essential you really are," I replied. The threat hung between us like a sword. Darian was right that he knew the business operations better than I did, but he was also revealing his true character. The man who'd spent years positioning himself as the responsible family steward was now threatening to sabotage the company out of spite. "You want to play hardball?" he continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Fine, but understand what you're up against. This family has connections throughout this state. Business relationships, political influence, social networks. You're about to become the most hated man in Thornfield." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." Dahlia looked up from the psychiatric evaluation with tears streaming down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of rage and humiliation. 40 years, she said, her voice breaking. 40 years I took care of him after Mother died. 40 years of family dinners, holiday celebrations, helping with his medications, driving him to doctor appointments. And he gives everything to the grandson who couldn't be bothered to call on his birthday. I called on his birthday, I said quietly. Once a year, she spat. While we were there every week, making sure he was safe, making sure he was fed, making sure he wasn't lonely. But you have one conversation with him in the hospital, and suddenly you're the devoted grandson. The pain in her voice was real, even if her version of events was distorted. She genuinely believed she'd been the dutiful daughter who deserved recognition for her sacrifices. The recording had revealed a different truth, that her attentiveness had come with strings attached and expectations of reward. I think, Margaret announced, gathering her documents, this meeting has accomplished its purpose. Everyone now understands the contents of Mr. Morrowind's final will. If anyone wishes to contest these provisions, you're welcome to pursue legal action through appropriate channels. She stood, which was the professional signal that our gathering was concluded, but nobody moved to leave. The family sat stunned and defeated, while Darian continued to radiate fury like heat from a furnace. This isn't over, he said again as I prepared to leave. You've made enemies today that will follow you for the rest of your life. Then I guess it's good I inherited enough money to protect myself, I replied. Walking out of that conference room felt like emerging from a tomb. Behind me, I could hear the family erupting into arguments and accusations as they turned their anger on each other. Dahlia was sobbing loudly now. Valentina was demanding to know why nobody had warned him about grandfather's mental state. Darian was shouting orders about legal strategies and character assassination. They'd spent months united in their campaign against me. Now they were fragmenting under the pressure of their exposed lies and shattered expectations. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. My phone was already buzzing with text messages and voicemails from family members, friends, and business associates who'd somehow heard about the will reading results. The campaign Darian had promised was already beginning. Within hours, half of Thornfield would know that I'd inherited $35 million under suspicious circumstances. The whisper campaign about my manipulation and opportunism would spread through social networks like wildfire. But I had advantages they didn't know about. Grandfather's documentation of their behavior was thorough enough to defend against any legal challenge. His psychiatric evaluation proved his mental competence. His recorded confession revealed their true motivations. Most importantly, I had Margaret Fenwick on my side, and she struck me as the kind of attorney who enjoyed dismantling well-connected bullies. As I drove home through streets I'd known since childhood, I realized that my life in Thornfield was effectively over. Whether I won the legal battles or not, I'd never be accepted by the social and business communities that had embraced my grandfather for decades. But maybe that was exactly what he'd intended. Maybe he'd known that inheriting his fortune would require leaving behind the family and community that had tried to destroy us both. The real test would come in the following weeks, when Darian and his allies launched their coordinated attack on my character and my inheritance. They had connections, influence, and the righteous anger of people who believed they'd been cheated. I had the truth, and $35 million to defend it. Time to find out which would prove more powerful. The war began the next morning with surgical precision. I woke to find 17 missed calls on my phone, and a driveway full of reporters from 3 local news stations. Someone had leaked the will reading results to the press, along with a carefully crafted narrative that painted me as a master manipulator who'd taken advantage of a grieving elderly man. Theodore Morrowind, the estranged grandson who inherited $35 million under suspicious circumstances, the morning news anchor announced as I watched from my kitchen window. Family members are calling for a full investigation into potential fraud and elder abuse. The reporter was a sharp-dressed woman who stood on my front lawn like she owned it, gesturing toward my modest apartment building as if it were evidence of my unworthiness. Behind her, neighbors clustered in small groups, pointing and whispering about the sudden media circus in their quiet neighborhood. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Fenwick, "Don't speak to reporters. Come to my office immediately. We have a problem." I slipped out the back entrance, cutting through the apartment complex's maintenance area to reach my car without confronting the media pack. The drive to Margaret's office felt like running a gauntlet, with every traffic light giving me time to imagine how badly this situation was spiraling out of control. Margaret's expression was grim when I arrived. Her normally immaculate office looked like a war room, with legal documents scattered across every surface and 3 different laptops running simultaneously. "They move faster than I expected," she said without preamble. Darian's attorney filed an emergency petition to freeze all estate assets, pending a competency investigation. They're claiming your grandfather was mentally incapacitated when he signed the will, and that you exercised undue influence. "But we have the psychiatric evaluation," which they're claiming was fraudulent, Margaret replied, handing me a thick legal document. "They've retained Dr. Patricia Wynn, a neuropsychologist who specializes in elder abuse cases. She's prepared to testify that the evaluation we have doesn't adequately assess the specific cognitive functions related to financial decision-making." I scanned the petition, noting the impressive letterhead and formal language that made every accusation sound like established fact. How can they claim fraud when they don't have any evidence? "They don't need evidence to file the petition," Margaret explained, "just reasonable doubt. And they've found witnesses." My stomach dropped. What witnesses? Margaret pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Thornfield County Sheriff's Department. 3 employees from Willowbrook Assisted Living have signed affidavits claiming your grandfather showed signs of confusion and memory loss during his final months. They describe incidents of him forgetting names, repeating questions, and becoming agitated when contradicted. Grandfather never lived at an assisted living facility. No, but he visited Dahlia there twice a week when she was recovering from her hip surgery last spring. Apparently, staff members observed interactions that they now claim demonstrated cognitive decline. The strategy was brilliant and vicious. They were using casual observations from people who'd seen grandfather during brief, stressful visits to paint a picture of mental incompetence. Anyone could appear confused or forgetful in an unfamiliar environment while visiting a sick relative. "There's more," Margaret continued, her voice growing darker. "They've also obtained testimony from Dr. Reynolds, your grandfather's primary physician. He's prepared to state that your grandfather was taking medications that could affect cognitive function and that he'd expressed concerns about your grandfather's decision-making abilities." "What medications?" "Pain management prescriptions for his arthritis. Completely legal and appropriate, but they can cause drowsiness and mild confusion in some patients." I felt the walls closing in around me. Every piece of evidence that seemed to support grandfather's mental competency was being systematically dismantled by medical professionals who were willing to reinterpret their observations to support Darian's case. "However," Margaret said, and something in her tone made me look up hopefully, "your grandfather anticipated this specific attack as well." She reached into a locked filing cabinet and withdrew a manila envelope sealed with red wax. "He gave me this 3 weeks before his death with explicit instructions to open it only if the family claimed mental incompetence." Margaret broke the wax seal and pulled out a letter written in grandfather's distinctive handwriting, along with several photographs and what appeared to be financial documents. "Read this aloud," she said, handing me the letter. I cleared my throat and began, "If you're reading this, then they've claimed I was mentally incompetent when I changed my will. They're probably using my doctor visits, my medications, and carefully selected observations to paint me as a confused old man who was easily manipulated." My voice caught slightly as I continued reading grandfather's words from beyond the grave. "The truth is simpler and uglier than mental decline. I discovered that Darian has been embezzling money from Morrowind Enterprises for over 2 years. Not large amounts that would trigger audits, but systematic theft that amounts to approximately $400,000. Margaret's eyes widened. We'd found the smoking gun. The attached bank statements show transfers from company accounts to a shell corporation that Darian established in his wife's maiden name. The money was then moved to personal investment accounts that he believed I couldn't trace. I stopped reading and looked at the photographs grandfather had included. Bank statements, transfer receipts, and incorporation documents that traced a clear pattern of embezzlement over 24 months. "He was stealing from his own family's company," I said quietly. "It gets worse," Margaret replied, examining the financial documents. "According to these records, Darian knew your grandfather was investigating the missing funds. That's why he accelerated his campaign to have your grandfather declared incompetent. He needed control of the company before the theft was discovered." The letter continued, "I confronted Darian about the missing money 6 weeks before my death. He didn't deny it but claimed he was borrowing company funds for investments that would benefit the entire family. He promised to return the money and begged me not to involve authorities. Instead of reporting the theft immediately, I decided to use it as a test of his character. I told him I was considering changing my will to make him sole beneficiary, but that I needed time to ensure he was truly repentant for his actions." Grandfather's strategic thinking was evident even in his final weeks. He'd used Darian's crime as leverage to reveal his true nature. Rather than showing remorse or attempting to make amends, Darian used my knowledge of his theft as proof that I was becoming paranoid and irrational. He told other family members that I was making wild accusations and suggested that my medications were affecting my judgment. The manipulation was even deeper than we'd realized. Darian had turned grandfather's discovery of his crimes into evidence of mental decline, convincing the family that the victim was becoming delusional. The final photograph shows security camera footage from the Morrowind Enterprises office. I continued reading. Darian accessing the company safe after hours, removing cash deposits that should have been banked the following morning. The timestamps prove he was stealing money even after promising to stop. Margaret spread the photographs across her desk like playing cards. Clear images of Darian entering the office building at midnight, opening the company's safe, and removing stacks of cash that he stuffed into a briefcase. Your grandfather installed hidden security cameras after the first thefts, Margaret realized. He was building a criminal case while pretending to trust Darian's promises. The final paragraph of the letter delivered the knockout blow. I chose Theodore as my heir, not just because of his integrity, but because he was the only family member who couldn't be blackmailed or manipulated by Darian's criminal behavior. Everyone else either participated in the conspiracy to discredit me or remained silent when they should have investigated Darian's obvious lies about my mental state. I set the letter down, overwhelmed by the magnitude of grandfather's final strategy. He hadn't just protected his assets from unworthy heirs, he'd documented criminal behavior that would destroy Darian's credibility permanently. "This changes everything," Margaret said, already reaching for her phone. "We're not just defending a will anymore. We're presenting evidence of embezzlement, conspiracy, and attempted fraud on a massive scale. What happens now?" "Now we go on the offensive," Margaret replied with satisfaction. Darian wanted to play legal hardball. He just discovered he brought a stick to a gunfight. She began dialing numbers while spreading the evidence across her desk in organized piles. "I'm calling the district attorney first, then the FBI's white-collar crime division. Your grandfather documented federal crimes, and I suspect Darian's theft from the company is just the beginning." As Margaret made her calls, I studied the security camera photographs more closely. Darian's face was clearly visible in each image, destroying any possibility of denying his presence in the office during the thefts. The timestamp showed a pattern of after-hours access that corresponded exactly with missing deposit records. My phone buzzed with another text message, this one from an unknown number. "You've made a powerful enemy. Drop the inheritance claim or face consequences you can't imagine." I showed the message to Margaret, who was still on hold with the district attorney's office. "Screenshot that and forward it to my email," she said, covering the phone's mouthpiece. Threatening communication related to a legal proceeding is another felony they can add to Darian's growing list. 20 minutes later, Margaret ended her call with a smile that could have lit up the entire building. "The DA is very interested in your grandfather's evidence," she announced. "They're opening a formal investigation into Darian's financial crimes, and they want to interview you about any knowledge you might have regarding his business activities." "I don't know anything about his business activities." "Exactly, which makes you a clean witness who can't be accused of participating in his schemes." The irony was perfect. The family member they'd painted as an opportunistic outsider was the only one who couldn't be implicated in criminal behavior. "There's one more thing," Margaret added, pulling out a final document from grandfather's envelope. "A revised criminal complaint that your grandfather prepared but never filed. He was going to wait until after his death to ensure that Darian couldn't intimidate him into silence." The complaint detailed not just the embezzlement, but Darian's attempts to manipulate elderly relatives, his conspiracy to have grandfather declared incompetent, and his systematic campaign to isolate me from family decision-making. "Your grandfather knew he was dying," Margaret said quietly, "but he used his final months to build a case that would protect you and punish everyone who'd betrayed him." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the depth of grandfather's preparation and the magnitude of what he'd uncovered. The family that had called me an opportunist was about to discover that their golden boy was a criminal who'd been stealing from them all along. The truth hadn't just set me free, it was about to destroy everyone who'd tried to bury it. The emergency probate hearing was scheduled for Friday morning at the Thornfield County Courthouse, an imposing brick building that had overseen legal disputes since 1887. Word had spread throughout the community like wildfire, and by 9 o'clock the courthouse steps were crowded with local business owners, former Morrowind Enterprises employees, and curious residents who'd heard rumors about criminal charges. I arrived with Margaret 30 minutes early, but the media circus was already in full swing. Television crews from 3 major cities had set up equipment on the courthouse lawn, and reporters thrust microphones toward anyone willing to comment on the quote-quote Morrowind family scandal. "There's Theodore Morrowind now," announced a familiar voice. The same reporter who'd ambushed me at my apartment was positioned near the courthouse entrance, like a predator waiting for prey. "Mr. Morrowind, is it true that federal investigators are looking into your brother's business practices?" Margaret stepped between me and the cameras. "No comment. All questions should be directed to the court proceedings." But the damage was already done. The entire community now knew that this wasn't just a family inheritance dispute anymore. Criminal investigations, federal authorities, and financial crimes had transformed a private legal matter into a public spectacle. Inside the courthouse, the main courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Judge Helena Blackwood, a stern woman in her 60s, known for running an efficient courtroom, had allowed public seating given the community interest in the case. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations and speculative theories about what evidence would be presented. The family occupied the first 2 rows behind Darian's legal table, but their unified front from the will reading had completely collapsed. Dahlia sat alone, pointedly avoiding eye contact with her nephews. Valentino and Kylan were positioned as far from each other as possible, while various cousins clustered in suspicious groups that suggested new alliances and betrayals. Darian himself looked haggard, his usually perfect appearance marred by dark circles under his eyes and a rumpled suit that suggested he'd slept in his clothes. His high-powered attorney, Sandra Mitchell, sat beside him with the grim expression of someone who'd realized her client had been lying about crucial facts. But the real surprise was sitting in the 3rd row. Detective James Crawford from the Thornfield Police Department, along with 2 men in dark suits who could only be federal investigators. Their presence sent visible shockwaves through the family section. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Blackwood entered the courtroom. She surveyed the packed gallery with obvious displeasure before taking her seat. "This is a probate hearing, not a public entertainment. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings will be removed immediately." Margaret rose to address the court. "Your Honor, we're here to respond to the petitioner's claims of mental incompetence and undue influence regarding the will of Lucien Morrowind. However, new evidence has come to light that fundamentally changes the nature of these proceedings." "What kind of evidence, Ms. Fenwick?" "Evidence of criminal activity by the primary petitioner, Darian Morrowind, including embezzlement, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." The courtroom erupted in gasps and urgent whispers. Judge Blackwood's gavel silenced the crowd, but the damage was done. Every person in Thornfield now knew that Darian was facing criminal charges. Sandra Mitchell shot to her feet. "Your Honor, these are unsubstantiated allegations designed to distract from the legitimate mental competency concerns regarding the deceased." "Are these allegations supported by evidence, Ms. Fenwick?" Margaret approached the bench with a banker's box full of documents. "Extensive evidence, Your Honor. Financial records, security camera footage, and detailed documentation prepared by the deceased before his death." Judge Blackwood examined several documents, her expression growing more serious with each page. After 5 minutes of silent review, she looked up with the kind of expression that ended careers. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm suspending these probate proceedings pending resolution of the criminal matters referenced in this evidence. Detective Crawford, please approach the bench." The detective conferred quietly with the judge while the courtroom held its collective breath. I could see Darian's face growing paler by the minute as he realized the trap the grandfather had set was finally springing shut. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Blackwood announced after her conference with Detective Crawford, "this court is now part of an active criminal investigation. Mr. Darian Morrowind, you have the right to remain silent." The words "every criminal fears" echoed through the packed courtroom as Detective Crawford approached Darian's table. The federal investigators flanked him, their badges now visible as they prepared to make an arrest. "Darian Morrowind, you're under arrest for embezzlement, conspiracy to commit fraud, and obstruction of justice." The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that seemed to reverberate off the courthouse walls. Darian's face had gone completely white, and his legs appeared unsteady as the detective guided him to his feet. "This is ridiculous," he managed to say, but his voice lacked its usual commanding tone. "I'm a respected businessman in this community. These charges are fabricated." One of the federal investigators stepped forward. "Mr. Morrowind, we have security camera footage of you removing approximately $60,000 in cash from company accounts over the past 6 months. We also have bank records showing systematic transfers to accounts under your wife's maiden name." Corinna, who'd been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly stood up. "What accounts? I don't know anything about any accounts." The investigator consulted his notes. "Corinna Belmont Holdings, LLC, established 18 months ago with you listed as the primary beneficiary." "I never signed anything," Corinna protested, her voice rising with panic. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Ma'am, we have copies of incorporation documents with your signature and social security number." The revelation hit Corinna like a physical blow. Not only had Darian been stealing money from the family business, he'd been forging his wife's signature to hide the theft. The man she'd supported through years of family politics had been using her identity to commit crimes. "You bastard!" she screamed at Darian, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "You've been stealing money and putting it in my name? You made me an accessory to your crimes?" Judge Blackwood's gavel couldn't restore order this time. The family section erupted in accusations and denials as relatives realized the full scope of Darian's deception. Dahlia was sobbing openly, whether from grief or rage wasn't clear. Valentino stood up and pointed at Darian like he was identifying a war criminal. "We trusted you with everything," Valentino shouted over the chaos. "The business, the family reputation, grandfather's legacy. And you were stealing from us the whole time." "I was protecting the family," Darian called back as Detective Crawford guided him toward the exit. "Theodore doesn't understand business. He would have destroyed everything grandfather built." "By stealing $400,000? Kaylin's voice cut through the courtroom noise like a blade. "By forging documents and lying to everyone who trusted you?" Margaret stood calmly in the middle of the chaos, letting the family's anger and betrayal speak for itself. This was exactly what grandfather had predicted, that Darian's crimes would ultimately turn the entire family against him. As Darian was led past my table in handcuffs, he stopped and looked directly at me. "You think you've won? You think this is over?" "I know things about this family that would destroy all of us. Keep pushing, and everyone gets burned." "Keep walking," Detective Crawford ordered, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Judge Blackwood restored order with repeated gavel strikes and threats to clear the courtroom. Once relative quiet was achieved, she addressed the remaining participants. "Given the criminal nature of these proceedings, I'm declaring an indefinite recess in the probate matter. The will of Lucian Morrowind will remain sealed pending resolution of all criminal charges against the primary contestant." She turned to me directly. "Mr. Theodore Morrowind, you are advised to seek legal counsel regarding your potential testimony in criminal proceedings. Ms. Fenwick can provide appropriate referrals." As court was adjourned, the exodus began. Family members hurried toward the exits, avoiding eye contact with each other and especially with me. But not everyone fled immediately. Dahlia approached my table, her face streaked with tears and makeup. "Theodore, I need you to know that I didn't know about the stealing. None of us knew." "But you knew about the campaign to have grandfather declared incompetent," I replied. "You participated in that." She nodded miserably. "We thought we were protecting him from making a mistake. Darian convinced us that you were taking advantage of his illness. And you never questioned whether Darian might be lying. He's always been so responsible, so successful. We thought he had grandfather's best interests at heart." The words were painful to hear because they revealed how completely Darian had manipulated everyone. He'd used his reputation for responsibility and business acumen to convince the family that his criminal behavior was actually protective family management. "What happens now?" Dahlia asked. "Now you deal with the consequences of trusting the wrong person," I said quietly. Outside the courthouse, the media circus had intensified. News vans lined both sides of the street, and reporters were interviewing anyone willing to comment on the dramatic arrest. I spotted Corinna standing alone near the courthouse steps, still looking shell-shocked by the revelation of her unwitting involvement in Darian's crimes. Margaret guided me toward her car, but not before one final confrontation. Valentino intercepted us near the parking lot, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "You planned this whole thing," he accused. "You and grandfather set up Darian from the beginning. Grandfather discovered Darian's crimes and documented them. I corrected. The only thing we planned was making sure the truth came out." "The truth?" Valentino laughed bitterly. "The truth is that you've destroyed this family. The business will collapse without Darian's leadership. Our reputation in this community is ruined. Grandfather's legacy is permanently tainted." "Grandfather's legacy is justice," I replied, "something none of you seemed to value until it was too late." As we drove away from the courthouse, I watched the family members who'd called me an opportunist just 1 week earlier. They stood scattered across the courthouse steps like survivors of a natural disaster, no longer unified by their shared contempt for me, but fractured by the realization that they'd been supporting a criminal. The truth had finally emerged in the most public way possible, and justice would follow. But as Margaret had warned, winning this battle had come at the cost of any future relationship with the only family I'd ever known. Grandfather had been right about everything, including the price of vindication. 6 months later, I stood in the garden behind the Morrowind family estate, watching contractors restore the greenhouse the grandfather had built with his own hands 30 years earlier. The morning sun filtered through the new glass panels, casting rainbow patterns across the seedlings I'd planted the week before. The house was mine now, officially and legally. Darian's criminal conviction had ended all challenges to the will, and the federal investigation had recovered most of the stolen money from accounts he'd hidden across 3 states. The family business was being restructured under new management, with several longtime employees stepping into leadership roles. But the real changes ran deeper than legal documents and financial recoveries. I'd kept my promise to grandfather by maintaining his charitable contributions to the Thornfield Community Center, the scholarship fund he'd established for local students, and the small grants program that helped struggling families with medical expenses. The money meant more than personal wealth. It was a trust that connected me to the values grandfather had lived by. The family relationships, however, had been permanently altered. Dahlia had moved to Florida to live with her sister, unable to face the social scrutiny in Thornfield. Valentino and Kaylin maintained polite but distant contact, sending holiday cards that felt more like business correspondence than family communication. Corinna had filed for divorce while Darian was awaiting sentencing, taking their teenagers and starting fresh in another state. She'd sent me a single letter, apologizing for the years of treating me like an outsider and thanking me for exposing crimes that could have eventually destroyed her life as well. Darian himself was serving 18 months in federal prison for embezzlement and fraud. His letter from prison had arrived 3 weeks ago, not apologizing but still insisting that his actions had been motivated by family protection rather than personal greed. Some people, I'd realized, never truly understand the difference between love and control. The hardest part hadn't been the legal battles or the media attention that followed the trial. It had been learning to live with wealth and responsibility that I'd never expected or particularly wanted. Grandfather's final gift had transformed me from a middle-class architect into a millionaire philanthropist, complete with obligations to employees, business partners, and community organizations. Margaret Fenwick had become more than my attorney. She'd become a trusted advisor who helped me navigate the complexities of inherited wealth while staying true to the values that had earned grandfather's respect in the first place. Together, we'd established clear principles: transparency in all business dealings, fair treatment of employees, and continued support for grandfather's charitable commitments. The most satisfying change was the renovation of grandfather's workshop behind the main house. I'd converted it into a design studio where I continued my architectural practice, but now with the financial freedom to take on projects that interested me rather than just those that paid the bills. My current design was for a new community center in East Thornfield, funded by the Morrowind Foundation and dedicated to grandfather's memory. Standing in the garden where grandfather had taught me to identify different types of wood by their grain patterns, I thought about the recording he'd left me. His voice had been weak but determined as he'd explained the choice between justice and family peace. Sometimes, he'd said, the people who claim to love you are the ones most willing to diminish you for their own benefit. Real love doesn't require you to make yourself smaller so others can feel bigger. Those words had sustained me through months of legal proceedings, media scrutiny, and social isolation. They'd also helped me understand why grandfather had chosen to document everything rather than confronting the family directly. He'd known that some people only respect power, not truth, and that justice sometimes requires patience. The inheritance had never really been about money. It had been about recognition, validation, and the right to exist as myself rather than the diminished version of myself that others preferred. Grandfather had used his wealth to ensure that his death would amplify his voice rather than silence it. As I walked back toward the house, my phone buzzed with a text from a former coworker. "Saw the article about your community center project. Your grandfather would be proud." I smiled, knowing that pride was exactly what grandfather had intended to give me. Not just financial security or social status, but the unshakable knowledge that someone had seen my worth when others tried to convince me I had none. The opportunist label had been their projection, not my reality. I'd never been circling for scraps. I'd been waiting for the moment when truth would finally have a voice louder than their lies. And in the end, $35 million had proven to be a very loud voice indeed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.